In Unit 7, we're going to continue looking at activities and intents, and specifically focused on what are called explicit active or intents that let us start up activities that we define in our own class. We're going to start by looking at talking a little bit more about activities and the activity lifecycle. So an activity in Android is basically one screen that we're displaying is a good way of kind of looking at it. And so far, all of our apps have just been using one screen and different things. At times, you might want to bring up another screen, and this is in a different activity. It's almost like a different executable. And we have to then pass information to this second activity and back. And there are some issues there. It's not just like calling a method and passing some parameters. It's a little more complicated than that. This session in Android Developer talks about the life cycle of activities, and we're just going to kind of go over this real quickly. When we launch an activity, we see some on create and on start methods that are called in that, and we often do our initialization of some variables there. The activity is running. There's an on pause and on stop activity. One thing we often see is that activity can be loaded in memory, and then it can be paused or put on hold, and then it can actually be stopped and killed by Android if it needs memory for other activities. So higher prior activities might come in. So we have got this ability that the activity might be killed off and recreated when it's loaded up. So we'll look later. We often have to save some state information with our activity so that if it is stopped and recreated, we can restore that state information to this. And then there's an on destroy when the activity shuts down. So this is kind of the general process of an activity. But I'm going to skip over most of this and go down to this section down here. So the section down here is navigating between activities, and that's what we're going to look at is we'll be starting up an activity from one activity, creating another one here. There are two ways of doing that: start activity or start activity for result. This start activity for result will call a method back in our original activity when we're done here. We create an intent like we did before. Before we were creating what are called implicit intents where we just say, I just need any other activity that can handle photos or something like that. Now we'll be using explicit intent where we'll specifically list the name of the activity we want to start. So we'll do things like we'll create an intent and we'll specify like the class name that we want, and we'll start that intent up. We can pass information to this intent through this intent through what is called the bundle activity. Similarly, we can start activity for results, and that will call a method when it's done. We have to have a kind of almost a listener on activity result that is called when the other activity quits and returns a value for that. So you can go over and review this material here, but we're going to look at a couple other examples to give you some more information. So let's start by talking about explicit intents. I'm pointing you to another tutorial here by Vogela. I don't think we've looked at a Vogela tutorial yet. There's some relatively good ones. Lars Vogela has them online. And so this is one of them that walks you through Android intents and stuff. One of the problems is that Lars has to apparently make a living, so there's ads here. But the material is actually quite good. I've been using Lars's tutorials for probably 10 years now. But he walks through this sort of activity and creating the intents, explicit versus implicit, sending parameters, that sort of stuff. So if you're looking for a little bit more material to read on this, this is a good review or a good tutorial on that. So we're going to look at a simple example of a second activity that we're going to bring up and look at. So we have our main activity.java file and our activity main XML file here, like we've seen before. But we also have a second activity here. We have a second activity .java file and a second activity layout file that displays information. So this is our kind of setup. So we have two layout files and two Java files. Now to create this, it's actually easiest if you create these activities by going right-clicking like on your folder here, saying new, and then going under activities, and then you can choose a basic activity. This will create an activity with a menu and this little pop-up or little menu down here that you can set up. Or more often, I will just do a blank activity. So go down new activity and choose an empty activity here. And this is just a generic empty activity. So I'll create a third activity here. Just give it a name here and create that. One of the reasons it's better to create this, and again, it's asking to add these files to Git, and I'm saying yes. One thing that's nice about using this is that besides just creating the class and the layout, the activity has to be registered in the manifest. So the manifest, there's a manifest called Android Manifest, and here we can set up things, some of the settings kind of for our app. Sometimes if we need to set up permissions, we'll put those in here, but also every activity has to be listed in here. So here's our second activity, and here's our third activity that was just created here. So again, and then our main activity is also set up here, and this is what's run by the launcher when we start up the app. So again, that's put in there automatically. So when you create a new activity, again, you should right-click and do new activity and create it that way, so it creates it in the manifest and sets things up correctly, rather than just creating the class and the layout file. Okay. So let's just look at these two activities. So the layout files really don't have any, they're just the traditional layout files. We have a button here that says go to the second activity, basically. Then look, if we look in our main activity, we have a on button click, and then again, when we click on this button, it'll just run this on button click code. So we are starting our second activity, so we have to create an intent. So we just say new intent, and then our context, we just say this, which is the main activity we're in. Sometimes if you're in another class or something like that, you may have to get a reference back to this main activity, but it needs the context of this activity. And if you're in the main activity, you can just refer to this here. Otherwise, you might have to pass this around. And then this is the name of our second class. So again, this is the Java class we're passing. So that's the activity we're going to create, and we just say .class to set that up. And then we start the activity, and here I'm going to show you how to start an activity with results. So we can just say start activity, or we can say start activity for result. So this is saying start activity for result. And again, we're passing in our activity here, our intent that we're working on. So this will then start up our second activity and run the onCreate method in that second activity. Let's talk a little bit about sending information to that second activity then. We do this with what is called a bundle, which is a data structure. I've got it linked in here. So it's just kind of an object. Sometimes you hear this kind of referred to as a bag or something like that. It's just it's similar to a map kind of construct in that we stick in values with keywords into here, and we pull them out with keywords. So if you've seen maps or hash maps or things like that, it's similar to that sort of a data structure. But we have to set that up with a bundle. So in our code, if we are going to store the name of something, or like here in our activity, we have the user enter their name and some number. And so we are just storing that name and number in the bundle. So every time we store something in the bundle, we have to give it a key and use that key at the other end. So we're just calling it main name and main number as our two keys. We're putting that in. So we're using our our intent dot put extra to store these things in the bundle. And then we are starting our second activity with that. Now in our second activity, we're going to pull these names out with these same keys. So in the second activity in onCreate, we get extras and we get our bundle. So this is our bundle object here, and then from that bundle we're calling it extras. We're saying extras dot get string or extras dot get double, and again we're providing those keys that we have here. Now right now I'm just using strings here to keep it simple. It's often more common to define constants for these keys or some other way of requesting those. And for example here, we'll show that in a sec. So here I'm just hard coding these here and hard coding here, and they have to be exactly the same, and there are better ways of doing that. But we just have to have a key for each to pull them out. And again, we can get a string or get a double out of here. Now we can put in different values here, walk you through a couple things. So if we're passing a string between an intent, we just say intent.putExtra, provide again the key name and then the string. And at the other end, we say we grab our bundle and we get string and then the name again, and we can start in a string variable. Similarly, for double, we can just say put extra and store the number here with some key and pull it out as a double. So basic types work pretty straightforward. We can also pass a whole array, so you can pass an array here and pull the array out, get. So we're always just putting in the extras. That's pretty straightforward with the key and the data. At the other end, it's different. We might get string, get double, get int array, get string array. So there's different options for pulling that data out of this. And we'll talk about in just a little bit about how to send an entire object here, and that gets a little more complicated. But for now, we're just sending the data there in the main activity and pulling it out here. So again, we passed in a string variable, we have to get string, and then we have to get double. And again, we use our extra, which is our bundle, to do that for it. And so then we're just displaying that information here. There's a couple other things here. These two lines just get the whatever text you entered here, grabs this text, edit text, and this edit text value, and parses those as either a string or as a double, and stores those. So that's all that does is kind of do some processing of what the user entered, and then we pass that information to the second activity. Now let's talk about returning the values. If you call start activity by itself, it doesn't expect to get any data back. But if we say start activity full result, then we have to declare an onActivityResult method that is called back here, and then we pass in a code, an integer, to the second activity, and then the second activity returns, and we don't know who's returning, which activities are returning, so we have to check this code. So in this case, I'm defining a private static int as the code here. And again, I probably should have been doing something similar for these variables too. But here I'm setting up my request code, or some code here that I'm sending to that second activity. That second activity or process, when that activity is done, we have to provide a finish method. So when we close that activity, it'll call this finish activity by itself. So we just have to declare the finish activity. And again, we have to create an intent, store data in the intent, and set some sort of result, and we're going to say everything's okay, and then we're going to call finish. We call the inherited version, the parent finish class, so we say super.finish. So we set up the data, push the data into the bundle and send it back to the main activity. So it's kind of confusing because again we're calling finish here, and that goes back to the Android system, and the Android system then calls this on activity result here that lets us process things. So we get the result code, and we get the request code, and again the result code, which is the information. So the request code is the code we sent here, and then the result code is if everything was okay or not. And basically when we set the result as here, we do it. So we generally just check things like make sure the result code is result okay, and again make sure it's coming, this code matches the code we sent the activity, so we know which activity is returning this. Again, we're only calling one activity right now and getting one back, so it's not that important, but it's good practice to be checking this. And again, now we check if we have if it has the new name here or not, and we can pull that information out of the bundle just like we did on the other way. And this is just popping up. Toast just pops up a message quickly on the screen to display something here. We do some error checking here. And in fact, in the second activity, when we are pulling this information out of a bundle, it is possible, some error might have happened and those things there. So we should actually be probably doing some error checking here before we print this out to make sure name and num are not null before we try to print them out. There's different ways of doing this. Here you can actually check if the data has data with some name, and we can do something there. Other times people will check if the result that's being pulled, if that's null. So there's different ways of doing error processing. But again, trying to keep this relatively simple as the first example. That's why I didn't do any error checking on this side right now. Okay, so this lets us go from our main activity, send data to the second activity and back. So here's the second activity running. I mean, this is the first activity running. I entered a name and a number. I'm going to say process with second activity. It runs the second activity. So I'm displaying this. And again, we're sending Tom and the number 77 over here. I can go back to the main activity. It sends that result. See the little pop-up menu, tom.css. .edu, it pops that up and pass the new name back. And again, I can change the names here. And my number, oops. And process this and get that information and go back here. So. And again, it sent it there, and all I think the second activity did was take the name, added the css.edu at css.edu on it, and return that back. And so that's why when it got back here, you could just tell it went to the second activity because it had added that. So again, these examples don't do much. They just illustrate the basics. So let's go back and talk a little bit about passing an object to another activity. It's common that we'll be working with an object and passing object there. And you can do that. You just have to work with something either called serializable or parsable. So serializable is this Java standard. You may have seen it before. It's used in Java a lot for serializing objects, for storing an object automatically as in a stream, like a JSON file, an XML file, or some sort of text file, and parsing it back sometimes. Sometimes we talk about the same thing, storing it in a database. So again, you might have some object here. You'll serialize it and create it into a stream of bytes, and that you might be storing it in a web or a file or a database, and then you'll be pulling that back out and deserializing it here. So maybe you have a data file like a movie clip or something like that. You want to serialize it and store that file in some of these places, or you just have a generic object and you want to store it out there. So in Android, there's two ways of doing it: serializable or parsable. This talks about compares a little bit and shows you examples of both. Parsable is faster, but it's Android specific and it's a little more complicated to do. So for this class, we're going to skip over Parsable and we're going to focus on Serializable. Certainly it's a very widely used Java standard, and a lot of things use Serializable, so I think it's a good thing just to get a little familiarity with that. This is a nice overview from Stack Overflow that talks about that. This first question here talks about Serializable and Parsable and when you should be using one, or the advantage of one or the other. And again, if you were doing a real app, I would push, if you have a team developing this, I would certainly push this to Parsable. But again, since we're just learning it, we're going to learn Serializable, because you may have not even seen that before, and I want to make sure you've seen that sometimes. So again, if we have a database or a class with some data in it, we can serialize it in different ways. This is a JSON version of it, so we're storing these first two people as a JSON file. So any way that we can store data or objects in a string format. Sometimes it's a standard that's JSON or XML, and sometimes it's just some other text standard that's done. So we're going to look quickly at that, at this pizza example here. So in this pizza example, the source is on GitHub. Feel free to just download that whole source and run it on your computer if you want to see it. I'm just going to walk you through it also here. And you can also just look through all the source code on GitHub. It links into the pizza activities, but you can actually go here. This is the whole activity this is the URL. You can download this into your Android Studio. And again, if we go into these, under the main here, resources will be the layout files, and this will be the main activities. So I've opened this up into our Android Studio. So I have a main layout here, and I have a pizza layout, activity layout. So I have this main activity layout where you can order a pizza, and then we hit order. That's going to bring up this pizza activity layout. Looks like it's a problem. Let me switch the theme around here. There. So it has a description. Maybe it'll display the picture of the pizza, and maybe it'll play the status information as we order a pizza, or whatever. But okay, so then we have two classes. We have the main activity.java class and the pizza activity. .java class. Now we're going to be passing a pizza between those, so we also have a pizza class. So we just have a pizza class here, information, the toppings, whether or not we want extra cheese, the size, the price, and the description of the pizza, and some information about, we do have some constructors and some utilities, but I kept this relatively simple for this activity. And so in the main activity here, again, we process the pizza ordering. You may remember we did a similar thing earlier in the class. We were ordering pizza, but we didn't do it with two activities. And again, when you click order, we are doing some processing, setting the size, checking if the radio buttons are clicked. We're creating a pizza then with some of this information. And now this is where things change a little bit. We're creating a new intent with the pizza activity. So you notice this has to match the name of the Java class that we created for the activity, and then .class, and this is the context. So we've created that, and now we're going to use activity. We're going to put extra, and we're going to pass our pizza object that we created here. So just like in the other places where we were like putting in a string or an integer, we're actually passing a whole object here. Now in order to get this to work so we can pass the whole object, our object has to be serializable. So we have our public class pizza implements serializable. So in general, we just have to put in, make sure we're implementing the serializable class here. What that means is that all the data in this class has to be types that Java can serialize automatically, or they have to implement the serializable class also. So again, these strings, booleans, double strings, Java can serialize all these automatically. So we don't have to actually put anything in here to implement the serializable class other than this cone. Now, if we had a pizza object that also had like maybe the toppings thing wasn't just a string but was a topping object, we'd have to make sure that topping object was also serializable here. But in general, Java will serializable most things relatively easily. So again, we can put in our ordered pizza right into our bundle, send it to the other class because it's serializable. So then we just start up our second activity. Now here we're just starting the activity. We're not returning anything, and so there's not a callback function here. In our pizza activity, so again, we created this pizza activity. In the pizza activity, we're going to grab our bundle. So we get content, get intent dot get extras here to get our extras. And then from the extras, we're going to get serializable. And the keyword has to match. Again, we're pushing a keyword here. And again, this should probably be a constant string, but I don't have it as a string right here. And we're pulling in that same constant string here to get the pizza back. And again, we're casting that to a pizza object. And so we're declaring a pizza object, giving it some name. And in this case, I'm just updating the description of the pizza, and we're just getting the calling the pizza's toString method, which returns the description, I think. Yeah, that just returns the description. So again, this just shows you that you can pass an entire object to another class. And notice this isn't called with to return, so there's no finished class here either for this. So when I run this, again, I can just select a pizza, hit order, and it'll launch the second class. It passes this thing in, and so I see it prints out the description: medium chicken pizza with extra cheese here, and I can go back. So it does send that information to the second class here. So again, back in our things, the main parts of that code I've pulled out here to show you so that when you're working through these, you can kind of refer to this code and how that works. Okay.